What happens when science is used for evil instead of good? Throughout history, some individuals have twisted the power of science for their own dark purposes. Human experimentation has led to some of the most horrifying abuses, leaving lasting scars on the victims and revealing the darkest side of human curiosity. Today, we're uncovering the 10 most evil human experiments ever conducted. Let's get started. 10. The Willowbrook State School Experiments, 1950s-1970s. The Willowbrook State School Experiments, which took place in the 1950s and 1960s. Researchers at this institution, located in New York, deliberately infected children, many of whom had intellectual disabilities, with hepatitis. The goal was to study how the disease spread and test possible vaccines. What makes this experiment so horrific is that the children were unaware of what was happening to them and were unable to give consent. The research continued for more than a decade, causing severe harm and suffering to the children involved. The Willowbrook experiments are a painful reminder of how vulnerable populations were exploited for medical research. 8. The Aversion Project, 1970s-1980s. At number 8, we explore South Africa's Aversion Project, which took place during the apartheid era. In this dark chapter of history, young men and boys who were suspected of being gay were subjected to inhumane treatments in an attempt to cure homosexuality. These cruel methods included shock therapy, hormone treatments, and even forced castration. The goal was to re-educate individuals, but instead it caused lasting psychological and physical harm. Many victims were left traumatized for the rest of their lives. The Aversion Project stands as a chilling example of how oppressive regimes used medical procedures to try to control and suppress personal freedoms. 7. The Human Radiation Experiments, 1940s-1970s. The Human Radiation Experiments, a disturbing chapter in U.S. history. Between the 1940s and 1970s, the U.S. government secretly exposed both military personnel and civilians to dangerous levels of radiation, often without their knowledge or consent. The purpose was to study the effects of radiation on the human body, but the experiments caused serious health issues for many of the subjects, including cancers, organ damage, and in some cases, death. This violation of human rights remained hidden for years, leaving survivors with lifelong suffering and raising ethical questions about government experimentation on its citizens. 6. The MK-Ultra Program, 1950s-1970s. The CIA's MK-Ultra program is one of the darkest chapters of the Cold War. This secretive and unethical experiment involved mind control research conducted on unsuspecting individuals, often without their knowledge or consent. The CIA administered LSD and other powerful drugs to participants, sometimes without informing them, in an attempt to manipulate and control their behavior. These substances were used to see if they could break down a person's willpower or even alter their thoughts and actions. The consequences were disastrous. Many of the victims developed long-term mental health problems, including depression, paranoia, and psychosis. The Unit 731 Experiments, 1930s-1945. Unit 731, a notorious Japanese military unit during World War II, is infamous for its brutal and inhumane biological warfare experiments. Operating in Manchuria, this group subjected thousands of Chinese prisoners, as well as other civilians, to horrific experiments with no regard for their well-being. Victims were often used as human guinea pigs for testing biological weapons, including disease infections like plague, cholera, and anthrax. Many of these experiments involved vivisection, dissecting living prisoners without anesthesia, to observe the effects of diseases and bodily reactions. Additionally, prisoners were exposed to extreme conditions, such as frostbite experiments, where their limbs were frozen and then re-warmed to study the effects of severe cold. 4. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, 1932 to 1972. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment is one of the most horrifying and unethical medical studies in American history. For over 40 years, 399 African American men who had syphilis were deliberately denied proper treatment to allow researchers to observe the natural progression of the disease. Despite penicillin being discovered in the 1940s as an effective treatment, the men were never informed about the availability of this life-saving medication and were left untreated. The study, conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service, continued without the men's consent, causing needless suffering, long-term health complications, and death. The experiment has become a symbol of the abuse of trust in medical research and a stark reminder of the exploitation of marginalized communities for unethical scientific purposes. 3. Lingqi, Death by 1,000 Cuts, China, 9th century. Lingqi, also known as death by 1,000 cuts, was one of the most brutal forms of execution used in ancient China. This horrifying punishment involved slowly slicing the victim's body with a series of small cuts, often over the course of hours or even days. The method was designed to inflict excruciating pain and suffering, with the victim ultimately dying from blood loss, shock, or organ failure. Lingqi was reserved for those deemed to have committed the most severe crimes, such as treason or murder, and it was intended to serve as both a form of torture and a public deterrent. The gruesome nature of this punishment made it infamous, and it has remained a symbol of one of the darkest chapters in human history. 2. The Nazi medical experiments, World War II. The Nazi medical experiments during World War II, led by the infamous Dr. Joseph Mengele, are among the most horrifying atrocities in history. Thousands of concentration camp prisoners, including men, women, and children, were subjected to horrific medical trials in the name of pseudoscience. These experiments included freezing trials, where victims were submerged in ice-cold water to study hypothermia, and surgical mutilations, where limbs were amputated or organs removed without anesthesia. Many prisoners were injected with harmful substances or subjected to disease infections in twisted attempts to study their effects. The bamboo torture, ancient China. And at number 1, we have one of the most terrifying and brutal forms of torture ever devised, the bamboo torture. This horrific method was used in ancient China, where bamboo shoots were planted beneath the victim's body, often starting under the legs or torso. As the bamboo grew, it would pierce through the victim's skin, muscles, and organs, causing excruciating pain. The shoots could continue to grow for days or even weeks, slowly tearing through the body as they expanded. The victim would endure unimaginable agony before eventually succumbing to their injuries or death. This method of torture was not only physically painful, but psychologically tormenting, as the victim knew that their fate was in the hands of a slow, inevitable process. These experiments represent the worst of humanity's ability to inflict suffering on others in the name of science, control, or pure cruelty. They serve as reminders of the importance of ethical boundaries in research and the need to protect human rights at all costs. Which of these experiments shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments. Remember to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more eye-opening videos on history's darkest moments. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.